The days had become a blur of tension, fear, and preparation. Alina could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, her mind consumed with the growing sense of doom that surrounded the palace. The power inside her had been awakened, but it was still untamed, still wild. She struggled to control it, but every time she reached for it, it felt as if the bond between her and Kale threatened to consume them both. It was late one evening when the first strike came. Alina stood in the royal gardens, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the lush greenery. She was alone. Kale had been busy with his advisors, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. But even in the solitude of the garden, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her breath caught in her throat as a cold breeze swept through the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing, his presence sending a chill down her spine. His eyes glowed a deep, unsettling red, and his movements were unnaturally smooth as if he were part of the night itself. The vampire hunter. You shouldn't be out here alone, Alina. The hunter's voice was low, mocking. You're more powerful than you think, but that power won't save you from me. Alina's heart raced as she took a step back. What do you want? The hunter's lips curled into a smile. What I want is simple. The power you hold is not meant for someone like you. And neither is the king you're bound to. Alina clenched her fists, the power inside her rising with her anger. I won't let you harm him, she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The hunter chuckled, his eyes glowing brighter. It's already too late for that. Before she could react, the hunter lunged forward, moving faster than humanly possible. Alina barely had time to raise her arms to defend herself before he collided with her, sending her crashing to the ground. Pain shot through her body, but she pushed through it, her instincts kicking in as she scrambled to her feet. She reached for the bond, desperate to feel Kale's presence, but it was too late. The hunter's power was blocking the connection between them, and she was alone. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she faced the hunter, his eyes locked onto hers with a predatory gleam. You think you can stop me, he hissed. You're just a pawn in this game. But don't worry, soon you'll be the one who will help bring down this kingdom. Alina's anger flared, and in that moment she felt it, the power coursing through her veins, wild and untamed. She reached for it, pulling it to the surface with every fiber of her being. The air around her crackled with energy, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble in response. The hunter's smile faltered as he took a step back, sensing the change. No. It's not supposed to happen like this. But it was too late. Alina's power surged through her, a wave of force that exploded outward in a flash of light. The hunter was thrown backward, crashing into the stone wall of the garden. He let out a pained gasp, but he wasn't defeated. You've only scratched the surface of what's inside you, Alina, the hunter snarled, pulling himself to his feet. But I'll make sure you never learn to control it. I'll take you down before you become a real threat. Alina stood her ground, her body trembling with the aftermath of the power she'd unleashed. She had never felt anything like it before, so raw, so intense, so uncontrollable. But even as she fought to steady herself, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't face this alone. In that moment, her mind reached out for him, pulling on the bond between them, searching for him. Her vision blurred with the intensity of the connection, but through the haze she felt his presence, a beacon in the darkness. I'm coming for you, Alina. Kale's voice broke through the chaos, steady and strong. Alina's heart skipped a beat as the power inside her surged again, this time in response to Kale's call. The bond between them pulsed, stronger than ever before. She wasn't alone anymore. The hunter sneered, his eyes narrowing in realization. You think he can save you? Before he could move again, a blur of motion streaked through the air and Kale appeared before them. His silver eyes burned with fury as he faced the hunter, his presence radiating power and authority. You shouldn't have come here, Kale's voice was like ice. You won't take her. Not while I'm still breathing. The hunter growled, but Kale didn't wait for him to strike. In one swift motion he drew his sword, the blade gleaming with an otherworldly light. Alina's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Kale move with the grace and power of a predator. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, and she could feel the bond between them strengthening with every passing moment. Kale wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting for them both. With a flash of movement, Kale clashed with the hunter, their swords ringing out with a sound that echoed through the night. Alina watched, her breath held in her chest as the two combatants danced around each other, their strikes swift and deadly. But the hunter was no match for Chaol. With one final, decisive strike, Chaol drove his sword through the hunter's heart, and the vampire collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The silence that followed was deafening. Chaol stood over the fallen hunter, his chest rising and falling with exertion. His eyes locked onto Alina's, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. "You're safe now," Chaol said, his voice softening as he approached her. "I'll always protect you." Alina stepped forward, her legs shaking with the adrenaline that still coursed through her. She reached for him, her hands trembling as they grasped his arm. "I didn't know if I could control it," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I didn't know if I could stop him." Chaol's gaze softened as he cupped her face in his hands. "You did. You've always had it in you, Alina. And now we know what we're up against." Alina nodded, but even as she stood there with Chaol's arms around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The faction was still out there, and they would stop at nothing to destroy her. But one thing was certain, she wasn't afraid anymore. Not with Chaol by her side. They would fight together. The night following the hunter's death felt too still, too quiet. Alina stood at the balcony of the royal palace, gazing out at the vast, dark expanse of the kingdom. The air was cool, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain. The silence that surrounded her felt heavier than it should have been, like the calm before a storm. Despite the danger that had passed, the threat still loomed large. Chaol's words echoed in her mind. "We know what we're up against now." But what did they truly know? The faction hunting them was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next move. The hunters were only a piece of a much larger puzzle. Alina could feel the weight of their mission now, pressing on her heart. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about protecting the kingdom, her people, and the future she and Chaol would fight to build together. Chaol joined her on the balcony, stepping quietly behind her. The chill of the night seemed to melt away in his presence, and Alina could feel the strength in him, as solid and unyielding as the very stone of the palace. His arms circled her waist, pulling her close, his breath warm against her skin. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Chaol asked softly. Alina nodded, her fingers curling around the fabric of his shirt as she leaned back against his chest. "The fight's not over. We won the battle, but the war's just begun." Chaol's arms tightened around her, pulling her in even closer. "I know. But we've made it this far. We've already overcome the worst of it." She looked up at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "Chaol, you've been fighting for this throne, for your kingdom for so long. But what if it's all for nothing? What if we can't stop them?" His jaw tightened, a flicker of something dark passing through his silver eyes. "We will stop them, Alina. Whatever it takes. You're not in this alone." Alina turned in his arms, facing him now, her eyes searching his face. "And you, Chaol? What if they take you from me? What if they tear us apart like they want?" Chaol cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing over her skin. "They won't. I promise you I won't let them take me from you. I won't let anyone come between us." The sincerity in his voice soothed the storm of doubts swirling in her mind, but the lingering fear remained, rooted deep within her. She could feel it just beneath the surface. The same fear that had haunted her since the moment she'd realized the full extent of her powers. The faction was out there, and they wouldn't rest until they had destroyed everything she held dear. But Chaol was right. They weren't alone. Together they could fight it all. The following days were spent in preparation. The palace had been reinforced, the walls brimming with soldiers who would defend it to the death. Chaol's generals worked tirelessly, organizing their forces for a coming battle that no one could truly predict. Alina, too, spent every moment training with her power, honing her abilities with a focus she'd never known before. She could feel the connection between her and Chaol growing stronger with each passing day. The bond they shared was no longer just a source of strength. It was their weapon, a symbol of the love and trust they had for one another. But as she pushed herself harder, as she learned to wield her power, she realized that it wasn't just a gift. It was also a curse. Every time she touched it, the darkness inside her grew, tugging at her, threatening to take control. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't pretend that her power wasn't dangerous. One night, after a long day of training, Alina found herself in the royal library, surrounded by ancient texts and scrolls. Her fingers traced over the spines of the books, searching for anything that could give her more insight into the magic she wielded. She had always known there was more to her power than she could comprehend, but now she needed answers. The moment her fingers brushed over a particularly old, worn book, a surge of energy ran through her body and she stumbled back, startled. The book fell open in her hands, the pages fluttering to reveal a strange script written in an ancient language she didn't understand. But as she stared at the symbols, something clicked in her mind. She recognized them. Not because she'd seen them before but because they felt familiar. The bond between her and Kale hummed with energy, and Alina could feel the power growing within her as the symbols seemed to pulse with life. The air around her grew heavy, and she realized with a shock that she wasn't alone in the room. A figure stepped from the shadows, his presence so overwhelming that it nearly knocked the breath out of her. "Did you think you could hide from me forever?" The voice was cold, deep, and familiar. Alina's heart skipped a beat as she turned, her eyes widening in recognition. The Vampire King, the one who had killed her parents. "What are you doing here?" Alina's voice trembled, but she refused to show weakness. The king smiled, a twisted, cruel grin. "I'm here for what's mine, Alina. You are the key to everything and I will not let you slip through my fingers again." The world seemed to tilt around her as the weight of his words sank in. She had always suspected there was more to her parents' deaths, that they had been part of something larger. But hearing him speak so casually about it shattered everything she thought she knew. "I'm not yours," Alina spat, her fists tightening with raw energy. The power inside her surged in response to her anger, and the room seemed to crackle with the force of it. She could feel the darkness trying to creep in, but she pushed it back, refusing to let it consume her. The king's eyes glowed a deep red, his grin widening as he took a step forward. "You don't have a choice, Alina. You never did. And now you'll learn what it means to be part of something far greater than yourself." Alina's heart raced as she reached for the bond, calling out for Kale, but the king's magic blocked it, severing their connection. She was alone, facing the one person she feared more than anything. And yet she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. With a cry of defiance, Alina unleashed the full force of her power, the surge of energy flinging the Vampire King back with a force that cracked the stone walls. The room shuddered and the air grew thick with the echoes of magic. "I won't let you win," Alina said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The Vampire King's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. "You're stronger than I thought, Alina," he said, wiping blood from his lips as he stood. "But you're still nothing compared to the power that awaits you. This is only the beginning." And with that he vanished into the shadows, leaving Alina standing alone in the dark, her heart racing, her power still crackling through her veins. The storm was here. And it would not be long before the kingdom would be torn apart. The days following Alina's confrontation with the Vampire King were a blur of uncertainty and tension. The palace had been on high alert, its walls fortified against any possible attacks. Yet even with the preparations, a thick cloud of fear loomed over them, heavier than any threat the kingdom had ever faced. Alina couldn't shake the feeling that the end was near, that the battle she had been dreading was just around the corner. But with each passing day one thing became clear. Her relationship with Kale had evolved in ways she hadn't expected. Their bond had become more than just a connection of power. It was a lifeline, a thread that held them together in the chaos. In the quiet moments when they were alone, Alina could feel it. She could feel Kale's love, his unwavering commitment to her, and the weight of his fears. The fear that he couldn't protect her from everything. The fear that the darkness inside her might one day swallow them both. But it was more than fear that held them together. It was trust, a deep and unshakable trust that allowed them to share even the darkest of moments. In each other's arms, Alina found peace. In Kale's gaze, she found strength. One evening, after a long day of strategy meetings and preparations, Alina found herself in Kale's chambers, the door closing softly behind her. The weight of the world outside seemed to disappear in the presence of his warmth. Kale was standing by the window looking out at the night sky, his broad shoulders tense. The light from the moon cast a soft glow on his features, making him look even more untouchable, even more powerful. But when he turned to her, his eyes softened and for a moment the king was gone, leaving only Kale, the man she had come to love with every fiber of her being. Alina stepped forward, her footsteps light, as if afraid the world might shatter beneath her. "Kale," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He smiled, the faintest curve of his lips, and motioned for her to come closer. "I've been waiting for you." Her heart skipped a beat as she moved toward him, drawn by the magnetic pull of his presence. She stood before him now, her hand resting lightly on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. For a moment the world outside ceased to exist. There were no vampire kings, no factions, no impending war. There was only this. Only Kale and her standing together in the stillness of the night. "I've been thinking," Alina said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "What if we don't make it? What if the fight comes and—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Kale cupped her face in his hands, his thumb gently brushing over her skin. "Don't think like that," he said softly, his voice low and soothing. "We'll make it. Together." Her eyes searched his, trying to find the strength she knew he had, but there was something in the depth of his gaze, something raw, vulnerable, that made her heart ache. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't perfect. He too was afraid. "I need you to promise me something," Alina whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "Promise me that no matter what happens we'll fight for each other. That we'll never give up on this. On us." Kale's expression softened, and for a moment she saw the flicker of something deeply personal in his eyes. "A promise. A vow." "I promise, Alina," he said, his voice unwavering. "No matter what happens we'll fight for each other. Always." She closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of his touch, the solidity of his promise. When she opened her eyes again, the world outside seemed to fade into the background. It was just the two of them now, and nothing else mattered. Kale leaned down slowly, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, tentative kiss. It was everything she had wanted and more, gentle, yet filled with the intensity of everything they had been through together. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against hers, and she could feel the echo of his breath against her skin. "I love you, Alina," he whispered, his voice a quiet confession that sent a shiver down her spine. Her heart fluttered in her chest, the words she had longed to hear now a beautiful reality. "I love you too." For a moment neither of them spoke. There were no words needed, only the quiet comfort of each other's presence, the unspoken bond that tied them together. The world could crumble around them, but in this moment, Alina knew that as long as she had Kale by her side, nothing could tear them apart. Days passed in a blur of shared moments, fleeting touches and whispered words in the dark. Alina and Kale found solace in each other, their love growing stronger even as the threat of war loomed over them. They shared stolen kisses in the corridors, quiet conversations by the fire and late-night walks under the stars. Alina found herself growing more and more confident in her own abilities, but it was Kale's unwavering support that kept her grounded. He encouraged her to embrace her power, to trust herself, to believe that together they could face anything. One evening as the sun began to set, Kale took her hand and led her out to the palace's private garden. The air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple. They sat together on a bench, the world around them quiet and still. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if everything were different?" Alina asked, her voice soft, her gaze distant as she stared at the horizon. Kale looked at her, his hand resting over hers. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, her heart heavy with a thought she couldn't shake. "What if we weren't fighting this war? What if we could just be normal?" He chuckled softly, the sound rich and warm. "Normal, huh? That doesn't sound nearly as exciting as what we have." He lifted her chin gently, his gaze locking onto hers. "And besides, I wouldn't trade this for anything. Not with you by my side." Alina smiled, her heart swelling with love for him. "Neither would I." In that moment, as they sat together in the fading light, surrounded by the beauty of the world, Alina realized something important. No matter the battles they had yet to face, no matter the darkness that threatened to pull them under, they had each other. And as long as they had that, nothing could tear them apart. They had found their love in the midst of a storm. And together they would face whatever came next, side by side.